Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I am your host, Robert Stanley. Today we are going to be talking about critical thinking with Dr. Caleb Lack.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. Oppan Gangnam Style.
From the Secular Therapy Project, Dr. Caleb Lack is joining us today. Dr. Lack, so happy to have you on here.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Robert. I appreciate it.
Caleb Lack, PhD, is a professor of psychology and the counseling practicum coordinator in the Department of Psychology at the University of Central Oklahoma. He also directs the UCO Psychology Clinic, a training site for graduate students in counseling, school psychology, and applied behavioral analysis. A licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Lack is the best-selling author or editor of 6 books. 6 books. I didn't know there were 6. I knew of 3. I knew of this one in particular, Critical Thinking, Science, and Pseudoscience. That's actually what I was hoping to talk to you about today, Dr. Lack.
Well, I'm more than happy to blather on about things I love.
Well, what are the 6 books, by the way? I'm kind of curious.
Most of them are about various kinds of psychopathology and clinical psych issues. So things like anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorder, things like that.
And a cooking book.
Yes. How to cook with Bigfoot.
Sure.
Just in case anybody happens to find him, I figure we want to make good use of that meat.
It's lean. It's a very lean meat.
It's so lean you almost can't even see it.
Part of critical thinking is kind of what you're alluding to here, is being able to not fall for dumb stuff. Would that be a pretty fair way to say that?
Well, and I think it's partly that, right? It's partly not falling for things that are pretty unbelievable. But at the same time, it's also not falling for things that are believable because you want them to be believable. So it's kind of a double-edged thing there, right? So it's yeah, maybe I recognize that when a tabloid is trying to tell me about the, Queen Mother having alien babies, that's probably not true. But at the same time, it's also being able to recognize that, I've got my own personal beliefs and biases that can help to make me more prone to believe information, even if it's not true.
I'm a big Bernie Sanders fan. So whenever it came out in the news that his wife was under FBI investigation and that he actually owned like 3 pretty nice homes, and he wasn't necessarily the poor man's poor man, he was a wealthy, right, lifelong career politician. I pushed back at these things, right? I immediately had a quick response for every single thing that came up, and I thought, oh no, I'm doing just like my father does with Trump. Like all of our fathers do with Trump, apparently. But either way, it was that moment that I thought, I'm not really thinking critically. I have a personal bias about a political candidate while I accuse others of having a personal bias about their political candidate. Can you comment to that in particular, how we can use critical thinking to deal with our biases? Yeah,
well, I think you gave a good example, with talking about your political candidates and your preferred candidates. And, this is something you see on all sides of the political spectrum. It's not just contained to the right or the left, even though people on those sides tend to think that about the other people, right? Like, I'm the rational one here. You're being biased. No, it turns out we're all biased, and we all have these kind of natural tendencies to develop and then particularly maintain beliefs once they are developed. And that can be about, believing that Bernie Sanders is, kind of a working class hero sort of fellow, or that can be believing that Trump is a, reformed man of God, or that can be about whatever you're talking about. So I think it's really important for all of us, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, religious spectrum, or any other sort of belief system, to realize that, it's not just them that has these problems. It's me too. It's all of us. And so I have to really, check myself when I start unthinkingly and non-critically accepting information just because it fits with what I want the world to be. And that's where we, I think, run into most of the problems in the realm of critical thinking. Yeah, sure. For some people, their belief in Bigfoot or ghosts, it might have a definite impact on what it is that they do with their lives. But for most people, it doesn't. So like if my dad believes in Bigfoot, like he's not going to be spending all of his retirement savings trying to hunt that son of a bitch down, right? Mm-hmm. But if I believe that giving this money to this particular pastor will help ensure that I get into heaven, well, that could have a pretty big impact on me, right? Or if it changes how I vote or what I believe about, a particular candidate or something like that. I mean, those things can have a really big impact on my life, positively or negatively. And so we have to try and make sure that we have as few biased opinions as we can, which is really, really hard to do.
Caleb, the listener is driving their car to work right now, or they're already at work. They got the headphones in. Maybe they're doing some laundry around the house, what have you. What would be a good way to just kind of introduce them to this thought and just walk them through almost a classroom format so that at the end of this conversation, at the end of this moment of their day, they will have super ninja brain powers, right? They will be able to go throughout their day with this added mental ability, as it were.
So I think the first thing you have to do is kind of define that, right? Like what does being a good critical thinker look like, or what does that mean? And for me and most other people, being a good critical thinker means that you're being a scientific skeptic. Now, what I mean by that is that a scientific skeptic is led to their beliefs via evidence. They don't let beliefs change what evidence they look at. So by that, I mean, we're a good critical thinker, they're someone who really tries to overcome their biases that we all have, and they try to overcome the way that we can naturally misperceive information. And they're also willing to be wrong. And that's a huge part of being a good critical thinker is having this, ability to basically say, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know that there's evidence, either way that persuades me on that, as opposed to just having a belief that maybe is less well justified by the evidence. Critical thinkers are really, they're fighting for nuance in belief. You try not to act as if you actually know things when you don't, and you're willing to just kind of embrace uncertainty. And that's a huge thing that people don't like generally. We like to know what we believe is true. And a good critical thinker is willing to say, well, this is what I think is going on, but I could be wrong. And I'm willing to have my mind changed based on the evidence that actually occurs. So, being a good scientific skeptic or a good critical thinker means that you're willing to be wrong, you're willing to look at the evidence, and you let those things drive your beliefs in order to have a belief that's actually what we consider well justified or the most likely thing to be true. That doesn't mean that you're what we might call a cynic or a denialist. People who say global warming is a hoax, or the Holocaust wasn't real, or things like that. Those aren't skeptics, right? Those are denialists because they're denying the actual evidence, right? They're denying scientific consensus, historical consensus, and things like that. So, scientific skeptics or good critical thinkers, they're really just open to new ideas, right? They're willing to change their beliefs if they're presented with strong evidence. Whereas these other folks, what you might call a pathological skeptic or a cynic, they have this closed-minded view of the world, right? Anything that doesn't fit with what I believe, I immediately discard it, find problems with it. So the first thing is understanding kind of, what a good critical thinker is, and understanding that, good critical thinkers or good scientific skeptics really value how we reach conclusions rather than valuing what the conclusion is. So that's not how most people naturally work, though. That's kind of the opposite of how most of us naturally work for very understandable reasons about kind of why we can't always trust our brain, which is the kind of subtitle of my last book. What you have to understand is, okay, well, what methods are going to allow me to reach the most likely true belief, whether you're talking about climate change or the optimal political candidate or, the best cereal to buy, or whatever it is that you're talking about. Because, all of us have to make decisions based on what we have available to us. None of us are omnipotent and know absolutely everything. We all only have access to limited amounts of information. So when we are able to parse that information effectively, then we start becoming better critical thinkers. A lot of that is involving really just kind of how I'm trying to reach a decision. So what's the methods that I go about collecting information and then using that information to actually guide my actions? What ways do I do that? And that would be what we would call critical thinking, right? So understanding that, okay, look, I as a human often make an error or show a bias when I evaluate information. And so I need to implement certain kind of best practices in order to make decisions about beliefs and in order to gather information that informs those beliefs.
This sounds a little negative, Caleb. Like, I know that whenever I really try to evaluate something based on the evidence and it contradicts with the way I already thought, right? And I have almost like an emotional investment in not changing my mind. And whenever I want to change my mind, Caleb, it's literally uncomfortable for me. It's not really pain, but there is a discomfort. It's like a mental discomfort. Can you comment to cognitive dissonance just a little bit and help us understand how it's not just that we might have a bias, but also like there's this consequence for changing our mind, right? Like an actual real feeling that is restricting us from being able to take the new path.
The easiest way to think about that, Robert, is to think about how much do people like being wrong?
Ugh.
We don't, right? None of us do. No one, when they're shown that they're wrong initially, is like, oh, great. You know what? I was hoping I was really wrong about that. Thank you for showing me the light and correcting that. No, like that's not how we work. Because what does it mean about me when I'm wrong about, let's say, a belief that I hold very dearly? What does that mean about me? Well, it means that I've been living a lie, right? Like I've been basing my decisions on poor information or things that are false. And that makes me feel bad, right? That makes me think, ugh, well, what else am I wrong about? If I'm wrong about this, I'm wrong about other things. God, do I suck? Am I stupid? Is that what's going on here? Right?
It's embarrassing.
Yeah, it's very embarrassing. And it's embarrassing even for little things, right? Like you're having an argument with your significant other or a good friend, and you're like, oh, no, I'm pretty sure this is right. And then they, pull up Wikipedia and show you you're wrong. You're not just like, okay, well, thank you, right? No, you're like, well, son of a bitch, right? Like that was, it's not what I wanted to have, even if it's not something you care about. But the more emotionally invested you are in a belief, or the more time you've spent with that belief, the harder it is. And this is why we see, it just be very, very difficult for people when they're confronted with facts and information that directly contradicts their deeply held beliefs. They immediately, flow into this confirmation bias and just say, nope, that doesn't fit. There's problems. I'm going to ignore that. And it's also why we see what we call the backfire effect, which is when I tell you you're wrong, even if I show you information that says this is proving that you're wrong, often what that does is not make you change your mind. It just more firmly entrenches those beliefs. This is why doing things like just arguing with people on the internet by showing them that they're wrong doesn't change minds, right? Like that just, if that worked, things would be much easier, right? You could just tell someone they're wrong and they would be like, oh, well, thank you. I'm glad that I'm now right. It's like, no, that's not how that happens. And that's why when you work on doing things like changing beliefs, whether you're doing something like I do, in terms of, working with patients who have severe mental illness, or you're doing things like street epistemology, like Peter Boghossian, right? Or you're arguing with, a friend about why Nickelback is, in fact, the worst band in existence.
How dare you?
They don't change easily, right? And so you can't just use this kind of blunt force, here's why you're wrong, let me show you how you're wrong, to change people's minds. And instead, what we need to do is we need to actually train people on how to think critically. And we need to train them on how to accept that they might be wrong and have that kind of in the back of their head at all times. That little voice that says, yeah, this is what you believe, but there's a chance you might not be right. So let's look at that side too. And that's to me why it's so crucial for us to have things like explicit direction in critical thinking, optimally from a very young age. But as you're well aware, Robert, that's not what happens in pretty much any school district or any educational setting.
I always hated that line, you can't reason someone out of something they didn't reason themselves into. Because I always thought, like, that is such a cynical way to view your fellow man. And one of the ways that I'll try on this broadcast, if I'm having a conversation with someone and we disagree about something, and I don't attack the scaffold itself that they're on, right? I'll just try to pull one board out. I'll try to phrase what I'm saying in a way of saying, this doesn't need to collapse everything in your world. I'm just pulling out a nail from one board, right? It might be a little creaky afterwards. It might be a little flimsy, but don't worry. Like, it's just one board. And if I think of that for myself, with what you're saying, suppose I do change my mind about that one board, being analogous to a small detail about a larger, broader concept that I really, really believe in. I trust in it. I stand on this. This is my scaffold for building my whole house, right? My whole life, as it were, my whole worldview. Whenever there's that board missing, I try to remind myself, hey, don't stand there. Like that's what we seem to do all the time. As soon as something starts to get a little weak, a little flimsy, like you were saying, that backfire effect, we double down. I try to remind myself, look, if it's something that just, it's not as strong as you thought it was or as it used to be, don't stand on it. Don't pick that fight. Don't die on that hill. Would that be maybe a healthy way for us to avoid that kind of embarrassment that you were referring to earlier?
I mean, it can. So, one of the things that we know from really decades of research is that, that whole not reasoning yourself out of a belief that you didn't reason yourself into, it's pretty true. I mean, and I'll give you an example just from this week. So I started seeing a new patient, and this patient has pretty severe obsessive compulsive disorder. And they were sitting there talking about the excessive cleaning rituals that they have to do, which includes things like, going to the grocery store and then coming home and washing produce and putting it away takes them like 5 to 6 hours, right? Instead of, an hour and a half like it should. And she's sitting there across from me and she's saying, look, I know this is crazy, but I can't stop doing it. And that really goes to this issue of the emotionality, right? And how strong things like particularly fear are in determining what we believe and then determining whether or not we're willing to change that belief and look at new information that could possibly contradict it, right? And, that's an extreme example, obviously, with somebody who's got a diagnosable level, mental health problem. But you see the same thing with all sorts of people, right? Whether you're talking about, let's say, a particular political candidate who you think is God's gift to the United States, or whether you think about your significant other and, ignoring or overblowing certain aspects of that relationship, or heroes that you might have in the particular realm that you like to have heroes in, whether that's, Hollywood stars or artists or writers or, just the guy that raised you or the gal that raised you. I mean, we are really, really bad at believing things based simply on good empirical evidence. It's just not what we do. And so in order to change that, the best way is to get someone to change that themselves, right? And to help them come to their own realizations as opposed to you telling them whether or not something's true. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually train people on how to, think critically. So in my, I teach courses on critical thinking. I write books on it. I give talks on it. And the thing that has to happen really first is for people to understand and come to the conclusion that, yeah, you know what? Sometimes I can't trust myself. Like sometimes I can, and that's great. But in other situations, I can't. And I have to be able to start differentiating those things, right? Like, is this a time when I can trust my judgment, or is my judgment clouded or biased based on these other, emotional factors, cultural factors, religious factors, what's happening there that could be potentially clouding my judgment.
So when you're talking to this person that is, it's taken them a long time to do simple tasks, right? You're trying to reason with them. Are you not reasoning them out of something they didn't reason themselves into?
So that's the thing is you don't build beliefs all at once, right? Like beliefs don't spring wholly formed into your mind. Let's say, as you do, said earlier, you really like Bernie Sanders as a candidate. Now, that didn't just happen overnight. Like you didn't wake up one morning and you went, oh, eureka, I love Bernie Sanders. Wait, who's that? I guess I better go see who that is, right? Mm-hmm. Like it wasn't a revelation or anything. You slowly learned more about him across time, came to appreciate, the things that he was standing for, trying to do, espousing his good principles for us. And you slowly, brick by brick, built this wall of belief, right?
Sure.
Coming to a different belief involves taking that down piece by piece, usually. For most people, when they have a change in, let's say, religious belief, or they have a change in a particular pseudoscientific belief, or even a change in things like political party, realizing that, this person they've been romantically involved with isn't, the right one for them. These things generally don't happen, Berlin Wall style, where it all comes, crashing down. Instead, it happens small, bit by bit pieces crumbling off. And that's kind of what you talked about earlier with that whole, I take one board off this scaffolding, right? So that's really what we have to do. And whenever I'm working with, whether it's a patient who has obsessive compulsive disorder or someone who is, I would say, brainwashed into believing various kinds of conspiracy theories, I am never trying to get them to have an aha moment while they're talking with me and working with me. What I'm trying to get them to do is lay the groundwork so that later they'll have that aha moment themselves. Because you're much more likely to believe something when it comes from your own self as opposed to someone else. So a big part of that clinically is helping people test their beliefs. So this lady, for example, we'll be doing things like, all right, here's some produce fresh from the store. Your OCD is telling you that you need to wash it once, let it set in ice cold water for 30 minutes, wash it again, and then repeat that 5 times before you can actually eat it.
Oh, wow.
Right. Now you and I are like, wait, what? Like I barely wash any produce, right? Like I give it like a, like a sprinkle, kind of like a Methodist, baptism, right? Just a little sprinkle and we're good to go.
Shake it off in a dog's water bowl, maybe,
Right. Yeah. But I can tell her, and she already knows, like, that's ridiculous, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Other people don't have to do that. I shouldn't have to do that. So what we'll do is we'll start by just, like holding that unwashed fruit. And just holding it's going to make her feel uncomfortable. But then that discomfort will go away eventually if you don't do the thing that your belief, in this case OCD, is telling you to do. And then we'll bring it up to her lips, right? Where, it'll just kind of gently touch her lips, but she won't eat it. And then eventually we'll work on, actually eating it, chewing, swallowing, and so on. But other beliefs are the same way, right? Where you kind of have to go small piece by piece. And it's better if you do that yourself, as opposed to having someone else, kind of bash you in the head with it. And that's where this whole, learning how to become a critical thinker comes in, because it helps to chip away at those beliefs that have formed across time without good empirical evidence, and helps you to replace them with much better beliefs.
Is that an emotion, that uncomfortability that she was feeling just holding the fruit? Is it fair to call that an emotion?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. In her case, it's similar to the cognitive dissonance, right? Where it's, okay, this person sitting across from me is telling me this is safe to eat. I'm telling, part of my brain is telling me it's safe to eat. But I feel terrified right now because I think I'm going to get sick and something terrible is going to happen if I do eat this, based on this other part of my mind, right? And so that's where, forcing people to test beliefs becomes very, very important in changing them. For example, let's say that you believe in alien abduction, right? Mm-hmm. And you think that thousands of people across the United States every year get abducted by aliens. Now, that might seem like a silly thing. Like, how can we test that, right? It's just like, well, you just stand outside and watch? Like, probably not. But we can test it by seeing, okay, well, what do the people who believe they've been abducted by aliens present as evidence for that? What do they give that says, oh, here's why I believe this? And let's test that out. We're not necessarily doing it in a lab, but let's test it out to see if there are, for example, any other rival hypotheses that make just as much sense or more sense. So, for example, we know that there's this really interesting phenomenon out there that's called sleep paralysis. And a lot of folks with sleep paralysis also have what we call hypnopompic or hypnagogic hallucinations, where they hallucinate when they're either going to sleep or coming awake from sleep. And that's a pretty well-studied scientific phenomenon. We can study it in the lab. We have good data on, factors that can make it worse versus better. We're increasingly learning, like, why is your body doing these crazy things? And if you look at what sleep paralysis looks like and what people report when they have it, and you compare that to the stories of people who've been abducted, you start to see these incredibly similar stories, right? Where I go to sleep, I wake up, I feel a, terrifying or scary presence in the room with me. I feel like I can't move. It may see and or hear and or feel things that are happening to me. And then I wake up, later, multiple hours have passed. It's morning now. I've lost time. I don't know what's going on. My bed sheets are all messed up, and, I feel terrible because I didn't get a good sleep. Well, that's sleep paralysis. And I know all about that because I've been having it myself for about the last 35 years.
Oh, wow.
And I had a hypnopompic hallucination last night, where I woke up in the middle of the night and I was hearing this ridiculously crazy sound. And I thought, what is that? What is that? And then eventually, oh, that's nothing. It's my brain. It's my brain being crazy. Now, because I know about those things, I don't start going, oh, well, there must be aliens here, right? Mm-hmm. But if I don't know about that, then that stuff starts sounding pretty scary. And then I start looking online for other people who've had similar experiences, and I start finding these abductee, websites and boards and things like that, and people are talking about this and that, and I start thinking, oh my God, that's what it feels like for me.
Wow, I never thought of alien abduction stories as like a mental illness or being correlated with mental illness, but that makes
not
a lot of
necessarily
sense.
Illness, but just misfirings from the norm. So like I don't have a mental illness from that, right? And most people don't. It's just that they're experiencing a deviation from the norm in terms of sleep, right? If you're having that and you have no idea what's going on, it is super scary. And I can tell you that because I had it for like 15 years before I knew what was going on. And I didn't talk to anybody about it. This is before the internet was really available, so I couldn't really look anything about it. I just thought there's some creepy shit happening to me. And I'm seeing dark figures running around my room at night, and I'm waking up terrified and in, a cold sweat, and I can't move. And I'm thinking to myself, what the shit's going on? And then I get to my first intro psych class in college, and they start talking about that in our sleep and consciousness chapter. And I start going, oh, wait, hold on. Other people have this too? Right. But if I didn't know about that ever, then, maybe I would eventually watch a movie about alien abductions or, hear somebody talking about it on TV and start thinking, oh, shit, that's me. Maybe I got abducted. But if I'm a good critical thinker, I will look for, okay, well, what other hypotheses are there to explain this, right? What are some other ways that I could say, oh, maybe this is what's going on with me? And whether that's a pseudoscientific belief or whether that's, a religious belief or, politically motivated beliefs or whatever, that's one of our kind of key aspects of critical thinking is being able to step away from our belief and say, what are other reasons why this thing could be happening? And that's incredibly important when you're talking about being able to discern, am I making a good judgment and a good decision? Am I having a justified belief? Or am I having a belief that doesn't really have much evidence to support it and back it up?
Dr. Lack, thank you so much for this conversation. I've learned a lot from you today. If somebody were really wanting to just really get started challenging themselves and with critical thinking, what's the best place to start? How can they really just take that first step and engage in this process completely?
I really think the first step is being willing to engage in that process, right? So if you're willing to engage in it, you've really already taken that first step because you're saying to yourself, you know what? Maybe I do need to look at what it is that I believe. After that, what I would do is I would direct them to a resource that can, help you hone those skills and kind of teach you, why you can't always trust the information around you, and why we, bias or misperceive that information sometimes. So that could be, for example, my book on critical thinking. That could be YouTube lectures from places like CFI or, the JREF lecture series from the Amazing Meetings. There's tons of great stuff from there. Or even, finding a class at your local community college or university on critical thinking and seeing like, maybe I can just go take that, right? Or edit it. Or a lot of times there are online versions of a lot of these classes now. So really, having some accountability for that will really force your hand, as opposed to when it gets a little uncomfortable, I put that book down. It's like, well, I paid my money. I can't really drop this class. Okay, I'll do this.
We've been talking to Dr. Caleb Lack today, author of Critical Thinking, Science and Pseudoscience, Why We Can't Trust Our Brains. Find that link in today's show notes, along with the seculartherapyproject.org. Dr. Lack, thank you so much.
Hey, I appreciate it bringing it on, and hope to come back again sometime.
Thank you to Caleb. Thank you to Dave Blair. Thank you to our patrons. You can also support this broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, I'll be asking an unreasonably large panel of guests, is social media bad for us? Between now and then, remember that you have the right to reason.
Bustin' makes me feel good.
Dr. Lack, thank you so much for this. I've really enjoyed just kind of listening to you, and you've kind of challenged some ways that I look at things just in this conversation. So I guess that's kind of the point, right? But I don't want to say that. That's corny. I guess in the end, we all have to think critically.